Hey lads, welcome to Theory Thursdays. This is a new series that I've come out with that's going to be coming out every single week. On this series, we're going to be diving into different chess books, studying real games from the best players in history, and learning chess theory together. Now, I'm not an expert, but we're going to grow, we're going to learn, and even if you're an advanced player or a beginner, I think this series of videos are going to be extremely helpful for all of you. The first book we're going to be going through in this Theory Thursdays series is Techniques of Positional Play, 45 Practical Methods to Gain the Upper Hand in Chess. And this is by Bronznik and Terekhin. Let's jump into this book. Chapter 1 of this book is titled Restricting the Enemy Pieces. If one piece is badly placed, then your whole game is bad. The whole of the first chapter is devoted to this adage from the Russian chess school. It illustrates different techniques for excluding an opposing piece from the action by means of clever pawn play, and it presents the subtle consequences of this, which sometimes reach far into the endgame. So chapter 1 is all about putting the knight in chains. And the first technique for doing this is by paralyzing the knight with wing pawns. I'm only going to cover 5 examples in this video, and next week I will come out with examples 6 through 10. Let's jump into the first 5 examples of this right now, and I think this is going to be super helpful for you guys. So example 1 is between Botvinnik and Boleslavsky. The year is 1941 in Moscow, USSR. Botvinnik has just played rook f to e1. He's lined up these 2 rooks on this file, and Boleslavsky plays the move queen to c6. Now, why does he play the move queen to c6? We always want to ask that question. Well, in this position, it looks like he's targeting that pawn on a4. So what would we do as a typical 1900 rapid player on chess.com? We would probably try to protect this pawn. If I was playing this game, I would probably immediately have looked at the move b3. I would have looked at the move queen d1. And both of these moves protect that pawn. The first doesn't protect this pawn. When we defend here, he could come in and grab this pawn. So I would probably have played queen d1 here. And you can see, according to the eval, that if we go queen d1, it's a mistake. The game is now completely even. What is the idea that Botvinnik played? Now we know this first section is all on paralyzing the knight with the duo of wing pawns. So it seems that Botvinnik has just decided to leave this pawn to be captured, and he's going to focus on this knight. Now you can see this knight is placed on g6. Now if there's ever a knight on g6, and I know this because I've read some of this book so far, a knight on g6, a knight on g3, a knight on b3, or a knight on b6. What you can do is restrict that piece. And so this chapter is on restricting the knight, putting the knight in chains. How do we restrict this knight? Well, let's look at the squares that this knight can jump to. I'm just going to highlight these squares real quick. The knight can probably be quite an annoying piece, but what is a way that we can really try to restrict this knight? What move would you play? Well, Botvinnik played the move g3, and g3 stops the knight jumping to both of these squares. So he's trying to, instead of protect a random pawn on the a file, he is trying to restrict the enemy knight. Now, this knight is not restricted completely. Boleslavsky wants to make sure that this knight can jump around and still do what it wants to do. Does Boleslavsky take this pawn? The book here tells us the continuation, queen takes a4, and then h4 by Botvinnik was extremely dangerous for black. Example, d6, h5, knight. Where does it go? Can it come to here? No, we eat it. Can it come to here? No, we eat it. Can it come to either of these squares? No, we eat it. So knight goes to h8, and then we can put our knight on f4, targeting this pawn. 2 pieces looking at this pawn, and we are doing very, very well. Even though black is up a pawn, you can see the evaluation says we're up 2 points of material. And look at this knight. It has no home. It's been put in chains. Now, this didn't happen because Boleslavsky's a grandmaster and he's not going to take this pawn on a4. So let's just go back a few moves and see, instead of taking here, what did he do after Botvinnik played the pawn to g3? He actually put his rook on d6, the best top engine move. So after Boleslavsky played the rook to d6, Botvinnik played h4, black responded with f6, and then white responded with queen to f5, attacking this square with 3 pieces, probably putting the rook here, trading off a rook, and then this would be a fork on the king and the pawn. So a lot of threats on this e6 square. Black responded with c8, white took on c8, rook took on c8, and then h5. Where is this knight going? It's probably not going back to the corner, but it can't come forwards, and it can't come over here because of the pawns. So the knight actually jumps all the way back to f8. Rook goes to e7, infiltrating. We know 2 rooks on the 7th rank is very dangerous. Double on the 7 is heaven. C to d8, knight to f4, and the rooks try to get swapped off here, but Botvinnik won't have it. He plays g4. The rook takes, g5. And here Botvinnik made a slight mistake. He actually took the pawn here with en passant, but what he probably should have done is bring the knight back here and reroute it, because now there is an open square here for his knight to sit on. An outpost is what we call this in chess. So this is example 1 of using wing pawns. White used these wing pawns beautifully to really shut down this knight of black's. So that was example 1. Let's go and have a look at example 2 of how we can use wing pawns to obstruct knights. In example 2, we have a game between Tamburini, who was playing the white pieces, against Botvinnik. This game was played in Leipzig, Germany at the Chess Olympiad, and it was played in 1960. You can see in the position we have on the board that Botvinnik has just retreated his knight to attack this bishop, and so the bishop retreats to e3. Now, knowing what we know about restricting knights, you want to have a look. Are there any knights on these squares? And yes, we can see there's one on g3. Now, you might be thinking, why is there a knight on g3? It's a bit of an odd position. The knight starts on g8, g1, b1, b8. How does it get to this square? Well, very often in a lot of chess openings, you'll play the knight to e7 and then to g6, or to e2 and then to g3. So it's very often that a knight does get placed on one of these awkward looking squares. So let's see, what move would you play against this kind of knight? How would you restrict that knight by pushing your wing pawns? Well, Botvinnik played the move h5, and h5 is gaining a lot of space on the king side. When you want to gain space in a chess position, it means that your pieces can start moving around a lot more freely. Now you have space for this knight to jump around, and your opponent doesn't have space. This square on g4 is attacked by the pawn, and the pawn is sitting on h5. So already white's losing a bit of space. So how is white going to reconcile this issue? Where can the knight go? It can't jump to these squares because they're defended. It can't come here because the pawn's attacking that square, and it surely doesn't want to go back to h1 or f1. So Tamburini decides, I'm going to make space for my knight on e2. Okay, a logical, very human kind of move. And so what does Botvinnik play? h4. He keeps attacking that knight. The knight doesn't want to jump back to h1, so it retreats to e2. Now that Botvinnik has gained space with these pawns, he now has room for some of his minor pieces to occupy this space. So his next move is extremely simple. He puts the knight on h5. And now the knight is looking further into white's territory. It's ready to move in and deliver some kind of checkmate. What does white respond? Well, white sees this knight on h5 and he thinks, my knight on e2 is kind of useless. Why don't we trade off the knight? So I'll put my knight on f4 and we can swap off here. And this is what happens. So the knight comes forwards. Botvinnik takes that knight. The bishop captures. But now we have the beautiful bishop checks on d4. And after the king goes to h1, what can we do with the g-pawn? g5. And what happens to this bishop? It can't come back to here because we just eat it for free. Our rook is defending this square. So we can just take that. It can't go here because we eat him. Can't go here because we eat him. He can't grab this pawn because this is defended. And he can't grab this pawn because it's defended. Now you say, oh, maybe it's not defended enough. It is. There's a queen here, even though you have a queen defending. So you could taking here, you just lose your queen. So that bishop is essentially gone. After the check on d4, the position's basically over. g5 wins the bishop and the game's basically won. Let's go to example number 3. And I hope that you're starting to see how we can attack knights with wing pawns. Here we have game 3. Petrosian versus Botvinnik. This was again in Moscow, and this was a World Cup game, the first of their World Cup, Petrosian-Botvinnik in 1963. And in this position, Botvinnik is playing the black pieces, and it's funny, he's in example after example in this book, but this is an idea that he just used to perfection in so many of his games. So you can see in this position that Petrosian has just moved his knight to g3. And already alarm bells should be going off in your minds. Are there any knights on these squares? Yes, there is. There's one on g3. So how are we going to attack that knight? g6 is what Botvinnik plays, restricting the knight. The knight cannot jump to these squares. And if you look at his other squares, he can't come to this one, and he can't come to these two. So he's only got one square that he can currently go to. The move f3 was played by white. And Botvinnik actually talks about this move, and he says the only reason that he can really think, there was 2 reasons why he thought that white played this move. One was maybe he's preparing the move e4, so after takes, and you can't take here because the knight's holding that square. Maybe, but it's very unlikely that white would have wanted to open up the pawns in the middle when his king hasn't castled. More than likely, the reason that white played the move f3 was so that he could castle. And you look, if you just take a back move, he can't castle now because the f pawn is hanging. You could just eat it for free. So he just puts it here, most likely because he doesn't want it to be taken. So Botvinnik plays the move h5. And this is already posing a deadly threat to get this knight and maybe force it back to this square. So white plays the move bishop to e2, vacating this square for his knight. Maybe he wants to reroute the knight this way, and then maybe looking at this square that maybe he's going to push after long castling. Long castle, get a rook to this square, and just force everything to push here, and his knight could be sitting here and forcing this e4 push. So that's why the bishop comes here. If the knight came to e2, it's not helping out in this push. After Petrosian played the bishop to e2, preparing to put the knight back here, black just played the simple slow move knight to d7, just getting ready to bring in maybe another knight into the game to attack. It's always good to develop your pieces. Petrosian moved the king to f2. Now, this is quite a strange move. What if he had, instead of doing this, had decided to castle? If he decided to castle, then again, we could have attacked with h4. And now look at this knight. Where does it go? It can't come to any of these squares. So it would have to go back to h1. A very, very ugly move. After the king moved to f2, quite a surprising move probably for Botvinnik. He was able to still play what he wanted to, h4. And h4 forces the knight to move, and it can't go to these squares, so it only has one square to go to. And f1 is not a square that that knight wants to be on because there's a rook in the corner. How's this rook going to get developed? Black plays knight f8, getting his knight maybe to another square that it can route around and attack white's king. There's a lot of developing moves here. Knight d2, the rook moves up so that there can be a rook left so that there's space for the other rook in the back. White brings his rook over. Bishop comes to f5. h3 is played. This move is not good because now white can never play the move g4. If white had played g4 here, then take, and the pawns are together. But because now he's played h3, he can never play g4. You can take here, and the pawns are never going to be together. This one's going to be an isolated pawn, and it's going to be an easy target for black. The rooks are doubled, the knight jumps around, the knight jumps in, the queen comes over to d2, and here in the notes, Botvinnik explains that g5 is just a crushing attack. And let me just go through these moves really quick. King g1, bishop takes h3, pawn takes, knight captures pawn on h3, check, and so the king has to move. The king goes h1, queen g5, h2, queen check, king is forced to take, rook takes e3. Whoa. King takes h4 because if the knight takes here, this is a checkmate in one. King takes h4, rook e4 check. The pawn captures the rook. g4 check. The king has to go to h5 and rook h3 checkmate. Pure beauty on the chessboard. That's not how the game went. The game actually continued a different variation because Botvinnik didn't play the knight to g5. He actually played it back to g7. But you can go check out that whole game if you'd like. But the point is, if you've got a middle game and you want to have a plan going forwards, think about attacking those knights with your flank pawns. It's just a good plan. I've got 2 more examples for you guys in this video. Next week, I'm going to look at the other 5 examples and go over those with you guys. But do subscribe to the channel, to the playlist, follow it if you like, and I will be out with that video next Thursday. Let's jump into example 4. Example 4 is between Spraggett and Ehlvest. Spraggett was probably the most famous and considered the best Canadian chess player of all time, and Ehlvest was an Estonian grandmaster. This game was played in Clermont-Ferrand. I think that's how you say it, and you can already guess what country Clermont-Ferrand is in. France, in 1989. White has just played his knight to e4, capturing the pawn that was on e4. And in this position, we can already see there is a knight on one of these 4 squares, and we want to attack that knight. Now, you might be thinking we could play g6 to restrict the knight, but what way can we attack that knight even quicker with a flank pawn? The move that Ehlvest played was h5. You might be thinking, oh, hold up. Can't white just take that? Well, no, we're defending with the rook all the way across the board. We have a rook on a5, and a lot of the time it's hard to envision this stuff when there's a piece on one complete other side of the board. You often forget that it's defending a square on the other side. So in this position, white plays the move f3. Why does he play f3? Well, it defends this knight, and if we are able to get in h4, the knight has to move, and we could pick up this knight on e4. So this knight on e4 really needs to be defended. It is defended by the queen, but it's attacked twice, so it needs to be defended twice. Black plays the move h4, forcing that knight to jump away. And the knight jumps to f1. Now, white is up a pawn, and so we can look back over here and see maybe black wants to regain that pawn. So that's what black does. Black takes the bishop on b2, queen takes b2, rook takes a3, and rook goes to a1. So here, black decides to swap off some pieces. Rook takes, and then the move f5. Now, why does black play the move bishop to f5? Well, quite simply, he wants to take this bishop, the pawn takes, and then the queen can capture and be up a pawn, having a queen. Look here, and everything is looking very, very strong for black. The rook comes down to a7. This is a decent move, attacking this b7 pawn with the queen and the rook. If the queen had originally taken this pawn, there's a nice little tactic from black. Black can take the pawn on h2, check the king, and the king will eat the bishop, and then the queen can capture the queen on b7. So you can't capture this. So white instead just plays rook a7. Now, what if white had, instead of playing rook a7, played the knight to d2? Well, then black could have played bishop b8, preparing his queen to come to c7 and attack the king. And if white had gone b6 to stop this, then he could have played g6, preparing f5. And f5 would attack this knight, and then the queen could come to d6 and attack the h2 pawn. So things could have gotten pretty ugly for white if white had led it. However, white plays the move rook a7, and so black plays the move b6 with a very sneaky threat. The threat is bishop takes h2, winning the rook. So how does white stop that threat? White goes queen a2, defending the rook. So how does black reintroduce that threat? He goes rook to d8, intending to put the rook on d7, so two pieces will be attacking here, and he still has this threat again. White plays the move h3. Black introduces that threat again, rook to d7, preparing to just sack his bishop. King takes, rook takes, so you'd win a rook for a bishop, which is very good. But here, white checks the king has to move, and the queen goes to c2, attacking this pawn. How do you defend this pawn on c6? Might be a little tricky. You might think, I'm not entirely sure. The move's rook to d6. And the reason this is such a good move is because the knight can't take, because the bishop will kill the queen. So rook d6, the knight moves f to d2. The two knights are together, and here the rook comes over to g6, looking down here at the king, already threatening to take the pawn on h3 because the pawn can't recapture because there's a pin. A lot of really exciting attacking chances, and although this example is completely drawn, you can see how two grandmasters think about the game and how they make plans, how they gain space, and how they attack the knights on the side with their flank pawns to make threats. I'm pretty sure if I had played this game online or over the board, I would have fallen for a lot of those tactics. I just wouldn't have seen them. The only reason I can see them now is because I've been reading a book on it. Let's jump into the last example of attacking knights with flank pawns for this video. We'll come out with 5 more examples next week, but this last example is a very exciting one. Here we have the final example in this video of how to attack knights with flank pawns and restrict them. This game was played between Yevseev from Russia and Loginov, who was also from Russia, but 3-time Uzbekistan champion, chess champion, I believe, in the late 90s. Black has just played his knight to d7, and it's white's move. Now you might say in this position, there's no knights to attack. I don't see what's going on here. But white is also looking at this pawn on h6, and it looks like a free pawn. It's not quite a free pawn because there's some quite tactical things going on here. So let's just have a look at this line, and I'll show you why white didn't take this pawn. White could have taken the pawn, and knight takes e4, attacking the queen. Here the knight would recapture, and now because there is no knight on f6, the queen can now check the king, and after the pawn blocks, queen can take h6 and win back that piece, winning a pawn back. So white won a pawn here, and black won the pawn back here. Now, in this position, white could capture the queen, black could capture the queen, and then the knight could take the pawn on d6. Rook could go to d8 and maybe win the pawn back with a discovery on the knight, but position looks extremely equal. So no advantage gained for white if white had taken that pawn on h6. These kinds of long complications are things that grandmasters have to really think through, and I am not at this level yet where I could see 6 or 7 moves like that. That's crazy. Let's see what white played instead of taking here. White played the move knight to g3, and alarm bells ring, and boom, boom, boom. What do? We need to attack this knight. So what does Loginov do? He pushes h5. The response, bishop to e2, because he's trying to vacate a square for the knight. Maybe white wants to castle, but we don't care what white's thinking. We just keep attacking that knight. The knight has to jump back to f1, and you can see here there might be a threat. The bishop can come to g5, and maybe he can win this pawn on h4. So how do we defend the g5 square? We move the knight back to h7, defending the square. Now the bishop can't come in and attack that pawn. We're actually defending the square twice because we've got a queen on d8 that is now looking at g5 as well. The bishop goes back to f2 instead, deciding to attack the pawn from a different direction. And the queen is defending it, so we're not super worried. Here, Loginov just moves the knight to e5. Getting it developed, getting it more into the game. Here, white plays the move knight to e3, trying to make some space for his king so his king can maybe castle here. The knight was really awkwardly placed here. It can't come to g3. It's just restricted. It can't come to d2 because the queen's there. It can't come to h2. So maybe here a better move would have been h3. That's what the engine recommends. And then the knight could jump to h2 potentially, but yeah, the knight came to e3 into the center, and in this position the bishop comes to h6. h6 pins the knight to the queen, so now the knight can't move because we eat the queen. It also sets up threats of coming to f4. So here, if the king castled, we could go bishop f4 and be looking at this pawn. We could bring the queen to g5, looking at this pawn. We could push h3. We could even move the king up to g7, get the rook over to h8, and maybe the knight can come here after the queen's here, and everything's just going to be attacking this side of the board, and it looks like there's a lot of attacking chances for Loginov. You really want to have attacking chances in chess. You don't play chess just to be passive and have a positional boring game. You wanna get a position where you can attack, and pushing flank pawns is one of the best ways to do that. So I'm just going to end this video here on example 5. The book says black has an easy and active game with this position. I think this book is really, really good. I am going to learn a lot from this book, and I've just learned a lot by presenting to you guys the first lesson in the book. I'm going to be presenting more lessons every single week, and I hope that you guys want to learn with me and get better at this beautiful game of chess that we all love to play, love to watch, and love to learn about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you lads very soon. Bye for now.